Okay, unaccustomed as I am. Right. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Platts, for the opportunity to talk at this summer school, winter school, and I must acknowledge the School of Astronomy and Astrophysics for inviting me to give this lecture. This evening's lecture is about an Australian astronomer by the name of John Tebbutt, and it's about him and his observatory. My name is Graeme White, and I hail from Wagga Wagga, which is, for those of you who may be watching this not in Australia, is a smallish town in the southeastern part of New South Wales, southwestern part of New South Wales, and so good that they had to name it twice. For those of you who are at this afternoon's talk, some of this may sound a little bit repetitive, so just relax, guys, it'll be over soon. Okay, I'm going to talk about one of the most exceptional scientific investigators that Australia story starts about 1834 in Windsor in New South Wales. So we need to get a feeling for what science was like at that time and for that matter what Windsor was like. Now the science of astronomy, as you know, goes back as far as human records do. And in the early days, one could easily argue that astronomy was so much linked into astrology, witchcraft, and other metaphysical concepts that there was very little separation, unlike today where astrology and astronomy are two ends of a rather vicious spectrum. Isaac Newton, for example, spent much of his time trying to do alchemy, which was, nowadays we look at alchemy as basically being wacko stuff. But so the sciences and the astrology type concept, metaphysics have diverged. Now, the reasons they've diverged is that, and I've used these little pictures as an aid memoir, is that astronomy gave navigators a way of discovering longitude at sea. That is a very, very, very long story, but it goes something like this. If you know the position of a star in the sky, if you know that, and if you know the time, then you can predict mathematically where the star should be in your horizon. Now, the mathematics is not simple, but the limiting factor always was, years ago, Greenwich Observatory was built to basically make maps of the sky that could be used by navigators so that they could know where the ships were. And as you know, maritime endeavours of the British Empire, well, they ruled the waves, they ruled the world for several hundred years. Okay, but a new science came along, pioneered probably by Isaac Newton, Edmund Halley and Newton and others, and that was to do with gravity and how gravity affected the way the universe behaved. So we went from being an observational science to being something where we tried to interpret the universe in terms of the rules, the laws of physics, mathematics, etc. And those very early rules were Kepler's three rules, Newton's rules, Newton's law of gravity, etc. And of course, that's all expanded nowadays into spectroscopy and gravitational waves, etc. But the crude starting point was basically the ability to be able to observe comets and predict that they would return. Okay, so that's the world of science about the middle of the 1800s. What about the world of Australia? Well, the world of Australia was an isolated just coming out of what you would call the convict period, isolated country in the southern hemisphere, where we were literally months away from Europe and the UK. So our lifestyle was, we had no modern medicine, no universities. Schools were probably very scarce. We didn't have a massive education departments like we have nowadays. Schools were church schools or somebody who would be employed by your parents or something to give you some sort of tuition in something. And this is a photograph of about that period. I can't guarantee it's exactly right, of the main street of Windsor in New South Wales. Now, Windsor is a separate town to Sydney. It is to the west of Sydney, to the northwest of Sydney, but in recent years, sort of like the last decade or so, it has basically grown into the city, or at least Sydney has grown past it. But in the early 1800s, it was a centre which had the centre of agriculture, and it's a little town on the Nepean River and the Nepean floodplain. And the Nepean floodplain was, of course, very rich agricultural soil. So it was a place where food was grown. It was a food bowl for the city of Sydney. But you see here a horse-drawn cart and a couple of, there's a two-storey building and little buildings here which are very modest indeed, and a guy standing in the middle of the road. He's probably completely bloody lost, he doesn't know what he's doing. Anyhow, so let's put our heads now back to the middle of 1800s and get our heads around the science and around what Australia was really like. Okay, now I've covered this morning. I'm going to go over it very, very quickly. The history of astronomy in Australia prior to this gentleman, you could really pin down to two events. The first event was the observatory built by Lieutenant Dawes of the First Fleet, 1788, on what is now known as Dawes Point in Sydney. And if you want to find the remains of the observatory, you go to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, you go underneath the Sydney Harbour Bridge approach on the city side, right down to the end where the water is, and that's where the observatory was. It was down on the point where the bridge goes straight over the top nowadays. That was built to establish a time service in Australia for navigational purposes, and secondly, it was there to see if they could recover the return of Halley's Comet. The fear was that even though Halley said it would come back, the fear was nobody knew quite when, because his mathematics was limited by the precision of his data, and secondly, no one was quite sure whether it turned up in the Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere. So to cover all options, Dawes was given a small telescope to try and find it in the south. Okay, I don't think he did, but please don't hold me to that truth. The second one, as I mentioned this morning, was the observatory at Parramatta, and that was built by Governor Brisbane and employed two astronomers, Dunlop and Rupka, and they did astrometric observations of the southern sky, double stars, etc. Okay, so that's the background. This is where we're up to. We got one observatory on Dawes Point, which has now been lost, and the second one in Parramatta, which at this stage was full of white ants and was falling down. And I don't want to say too cruel about the people at that period, but it appears that the whole thing was a bit shabby, shall we say. Okay, so along comes John Tebbutt. Now, this is a photograph of him in his elder age. I don't have any photos of him as a baby, but I do have somewhere in my archive at home a photograph of his cradle. So there you go, that's not bad. This is obviously a posed photo. It was taken somewhere about 1905. But this is the man himself as an elderly gentleman. And here's a potted history of the man. By no means comprehensive. There are far better biographies available than anything I can give you. But, okay, let me read it to you. Born in Windsor, New South Wales. His father was a prosperous storekeeper. I believe it was a haberdashery clothing type shop. And his granddad was one of the early settlers in Australia. I believe he was a free settler, as to be distinct, somewhat different to some of my ancestry who came out here, compliments of the Transportation Department of Her Majesty. And they arrived in Sydney in 1801. Now bear in mind that the first fleet was 1788, so this is what, 12, 13 years. So you imagine getting off the boat 13 years later. There was no Park Regis at that stage. It was very, very crude and very rough. You know, the place was full of crooks, to be honest. My ancestry being one of them. Okay, now he, the son, John, John's a family name. I think they're up to number 5 at the moment. John was educated in the Church of England parish school. As I said, education, premium, hard to get, and by a local minister, and from what we can gather, it was an absolutely rigorous education, not just sort of casual education that some of us, unfortunately, are forced to take nowadays. Okay, so a very rigorous education. The guy was all his life a devout Christian. I'm going to come back to that. He finished school at the age of 15. Now that may sound a bit young to the modern generation, but 15 in those days was actually quite a substantive education. If you stayed at school till you're 15, it was quite substantive. But he left at school at age 15, and his father at this stage had moved from haberdashery to owning a farm on the Hawkesbury River. I think I may have earlier said it was an Nepean River, and I'm not quite sure what the truth is there. The two. Anyhow, his father got a farm, and a very big farm, and it was bounded by the Hawkesbury River on one side and a creek called South Creek, which ran down the other side. And because of the way the water ran around this property, it was called the Peninsula Farm. So he took up farming with his father, and then that was 1844. They built the Peninsula House, which is still one of the classic, beautiful, big, monumental Western Sydney houses, and then he inherited the whole property, etc. I'm reading this as I go. Right, so he inherited the whole property, and at this stage I suspect he was quite a wealthy man, probably very wealthy man. Now, as a man, he was an intellectual. He was a learner, a person who studied things, but mostly self-taught. The self-taught bit went to farming techniques. Okay, he needed that to live, but he taught himself French and German, because he wanted to be able to read scientific papers and journals coming from France, and he also learned Greek and Latin. These are, of course, the basic languages you need if you want to explore the Bible for yourself. Early Bible studies are in Greek. Okay. He also applied himself to astronomy, and not just, what star is that, and whether I'm a Sagittarian or not, but more to the mathematics behind the celestial mechanics. Now he bought himself a small telescope and a sextant. A sextant is an instrument for measuring height. It's those things that sailors use. It's called a sextant because it's a sixth, 1/6 of a circle, 1/6 of a circle, sextant. And he also had what you'd nowadays call a grandfather's clock, which had a 1 second escapement. A pendulum went 1 second. So he had that clock, which he used as a regulator for celestial observations. And he also had a small telescope, which he managed to acquire. And historians believe this may actually be the telescope It's what you call a naval type telescope, but it was where he started his scientific career as a young man. Right. In 1861, bearing in mind he was born in 1834, so it makes him 19, does it? 29.
Yeah.
29. Sorry, maths is not my best point. Right. He discovered a comet, which was called the Great Comet of 1861, and one of the brightest comets ever found. But in those days, there was no means of communicating this to the rest of the world, so he wrote a letter to the local newspaper, and it wasn't basically for something like 6 weeks that the message got to Europe that he had actually discovered it. But he was the first, and he was recognised as being the discoverer of Comet 1861. And I'll come back and talk more about that later. Okay, he then went out, got a rush of blood, went out and bought himself a telescope, which we think may be this one. If you read down the bottom here, it says, reputed to belong to Reverend Scott or John Tebbutt. So there is some doubt there, but that's basically what it is. It's about a 3-inch aperture, 75mm aperture telescope. And at the time, it's probably worth a very large amount of money. But an interesting, more of an advanced hobby type of instrument. Right, now in 1862, remember this is 1 year after the comet discovery, the Sydney Observatory, which is now the third of the great observatories in the sequence, had just been built. This observatory was to replace the observatory of Parramatta. And it was opened in 1858, and it was there to do specifically naval astronomy. That is, here you can see shutters through the building for transit instruments to determine time, to keep the clocks in the observatory running precisely correct. And this ball here was lifted up every day prior to either midday or 1 o'clock, and it was dropped on the hour, fell down, and the idea being that the ships in Sydney Harbour would have probably their most senior staff observing, looking at the ball, and when it fell, they'd say, right, and they'd check the clocks on the ship. That's how you keep the chronometers on the ship accurate. But you need this ground-based observatory to do that. So this was also a meteorological station, and even up till now, you may hear things like, it was raining at Observatory Hill. Okay, so this observatory was opened in 1858, and 1862, was 3-4 years later, he was offered the position of the government astronomer. In other words, he was given the job of being the man in charge, and he declined it. And we'll come back to that. Okay, so instead, a couple of years after that, he built his built his own observatory, which had that 3-inch telescope in, a 2-inch transit instrument. These are the ones that go like this across the sky, so you can measure time and star positions, and an 8-day half-second box chronometer, which is a clock that the hand moved every half-second, and it was boxed. In other words, it was protected in such a way that it wouldn't be affected by magnetic fields and things. So he was setting himself up to do real science. And the observatory he built was this one, and that's a photograph of him there. And this is the turret where the 3¼ inch telescope was. And you can see now he's emulated the Sydney Observatory. Has this hole through the roof which goes like that, and another one over there. The transit instrument sits inside. It looks on an axis which looks up through this slot. And this slot runs north-south, runs absolutely north-south. So the instrument goes like this, and as the stars come past, you note down the time. I don't know what that there is. It looks like a beehive, but I don't think it is. I think it's called, it's probably a modern day version of one of these, a Stevenson weather box, which for temperature, reading temperature, up the top wind, there's a wind speed gadget up there, etc. And this was probably his rainfall gadget. So he was setting up an observatory to do both astronomy and meteorology. Okay, in 1863, which is a little bit, just 1 year prior to that photo, he started making regular weather observations at Windsor, and that kept up for something like 30 odd years. And he published them under the title of Meteorological Observations made at the private observatory of John Tebbutt Jr. Okay, so he was doing weather observations at the same time. Okay, so he now starts to build up more horsepower. Next thing to come was a 4.5-inch telescope, which was starting now to get, for that period of time, to be a substantive instrument. It was a substantive telescope for that period of time. Then in 1881, he goes and discovers another comet, and I'm skipping quite quickly through the history. 1886, he gets now a bigger telescope still. This was one of the great telescopes in Australian history. This was an 8-inch Grubb refractor made by the Irish company Grubb, who were part of Grubb Parsons, who the people who made the marine steam turbine, which you've probably heard of. Anyhow, Grubb was a Grubb refractor. It was a very powerful, big instrument. And maybe I'm just jumping ahead here a little bit, but I understand that its cost was £400 in 1886, which was equivalent to buying 4 houses in Windsor. So now a house in Windsor nowadays is worth roughly what? Probably £1 million. So you multiply it by 4, you get £4 million. So that's kind of roughly the equivalent value to the thing. He went down and wrote a book about himself, 1887, and then I'll just come back to the history in a minute. Okay, so this is basically the history now of the actual physical observatories at Windsor. 1863, the regional timber observatory. White ants were, of course, the killer of all timber buildings of that period. Then a circular building replaced by a brick one, 1887. 1897, a brick structure including a library and transit rooms, and then 1894, another circular building made for the 8-inch Grubb telescope. That sign is still there, and it's in front of the observatory if you ever go. This was the observatory now in its heyday. The original building, which got white ant and badly influenced by the forces of gravity. The second building, this one here, was built for the 4-inch telescope. That one was demolished. And this one is the main building. This consisted of I think this is the 3-inch telescope was in here. And this part here was a library, and it had a chimney in it, and it was actually had a fireplace in it, and it was stacked full of volumes of journals, not books, but scientific journals coming out of Europe, and just absolutely stacked full of this stuff, which people were sending him because he was this stage he was getting quite well known. And in here there is a transit shutter again to allow the transit telescope to look along the meridian. So that photo is pretty old. This is a little bit better, gives you a bit better idea what the building was about. I'll let you have a look at this later if you like. Brick, quite ornate in its own sort of childish way. And this is the back view. And and here's the plan of the building: library, bedroom. Oh, now I'll come back to that. Office and computing room. Now, computing room in those days was where you sat with a pencil and paper, not with a computer. And a person who did mathematics with a pencil and paper was called a computer. Got it? Okay, so this was a computing room with the equatorial room above the roof. And this was the meridian and transit room. And this is the prime vertical chamber. That was another, I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, at some point later in the history of the family, after he died, it was also turned into a small flat and was leased out. So you'll see also bedroom, breakfast room, kitchen, laundry, lounge, bedroom. Okay, over here now is the equatorial room. This was for the smaller telescope, the 4-inch telescope there. Okay, this is what's there today, if you should happen to wheel past. As you can see, it's pretty well unscathed. Again, I point out the shutter. And Mr. Hercules standing in the front there. Actually, I think it's Mr. Atlas. I may be wrong about that. And you can see it's really very, very pleasantly preserved at the moment. It did go for a bit of a low period, but I think some grant money came their way and they preserved it. And around the back, so let me go back, at the back of this building, behind this portico on the back of that brick box is the vertical chamber room, and this one has also got the shutter through the wall, except this shutter now points east-west rather than the other one which points north-south. And if you ask me later, I'll tell you why that is. It's another mechanism of determining the declination of stars. Okay, the roof of the building is something like that, and you can see, of course, this is now well over 100 years old, so you get a feeling for the architecture. And now, in the foreground, this is the second circular building built for the 8-inch telescope, which came from Graeme White. And here you can see this pyramidal dome goes around, and this is just a door which opens up, and so the telescope can see out. And it's really quite architecturally rather eloquent, actually. It's a circular brick building with some wheels here which run on a track, and that goes around, and then the shutter in the roof, the door opens in the roof to allow you to look out. Okay, and quite a lot of ivy, and there should be more, but there are very few pictures available of the actual instrument. Now, this is the 8-inch Grubb telescope, and this was taken, I suspect, probably well into the 20th century. He's a very old man here, and that's the telescope. And as I said, Maiden Island, it's a refracting telescope, so the lens at the top, and the eyepiece is at the bottom, and it's what we call nowadays a German equatorial mount. So here's the polar axis, here's the declination axis, these are the counterweights. They balance the telescope around this axis. This is set to the latitude of the observatory, which is about 35 degrees, fine adjustment here, etc. So a very substantive instrument. Yeah, at least worth 4 houses. If you pay 4 houses, which I'll buy one. Okay, so a little bit more about the man. He established what is called the British Astronomical Association branch, a branch of this in New South Wales, and he was immediately elected first president. In 1904, he decided that he would no longer do systematic observations. He said, "That's it. I'm too old to pack it in." But, and this is a true story which nobody will ever tell you. No, very few people know the story. He said he'd pack it in 1904. I was living in France in 1979. Before Halley's Comet came, which was 1986. And I went to a meeting of astronomers, and I met up with a fellow who said, I want to buy you a drink. So after the meetings, I went for a drink. He came from Heidelberg, from the Astronomy Richten Institute in Heidelberg, and his job, he was being paid by the European Space Agency to work out the orbit of Halley's Comet. And of course, he said, as I did, why? He said, because we're going to put a space probe through the head of it. The space probe was called Giotto. You may remember Giotto. Okay, so he wanted every observation there ever was of Halley's Comet over as long period of history as he could find. And I said, well, look, I do believe this old dude back there in Australia called John Tebbutt. I said, he was around then. He was pretty sharp. I said, I'll see what I can do. So actually, what I found out was Tebbutt came out of retirement. Not many people know this. Came out of retirement in 1910 and observed Halley's Comet. And he made a large number of observations on its position in the sky, which is exactly what the Astronomy Richten Institute in Heidelberg wanted. So I got all this stuff and sent it off to this friend of mine named Siegfried. And Siegfried wrote back and he said, we must publish this not as an astronomy paper, but as a history paper. So there is actually hiding in the literature a paper entitled Halley's Comet Observations by John Tebbutt, 1910, by myself and Siegfried Rosa. And so once Siegfried had got the best possible orbit from all the observations over hundreds of years, all the different apparitions, you can then draw a smooth line through all that and work out then how much wrong each of the observations, individual observations, were with respect to the average of the ensemble. Make sense? Okay, so he did that, and Tebbutt was basically one of the best sets of observations there were. His errors were less than an arc second in position, and which is really, in my view, the most amazing feat, given that he was something like 86 years old. It's quite amazing. Anyhow, so that's a little known story which you will not probably find in most biographies. Okay, now in 1908, before Halley came, he wrote a book which he called Astronomical Memoirs, giving an account of 54 years, less than Halley's stuff, of his astronomical work. And I have here a copy which I'll show you, at least a reprint. Okay. Yes. Now, I'm just going to jump that. Now, I'll come back to that slide. Now, the truth is, he was actually what we probably call nowadays a godfather. And he was a very devout man. And so devout, in fact, that he got himself rather entangled with the Church of England. And the situation is that he, and I have a friend who's a very devout man as well. And he tried to explain it to me in terms of the High Church and Low Church of England. Now, those of you who understand the Church of England will know that there is a High Church and Low Church, and that sort of carries back to the Reformation under Henry VIII, where Catholics were basically bundled out of England. And you end up with sort of two churches, one a true Church of England, and one sort of a Church of England hybrid Catholic church. And that sort of, so anyhow, this carried on, and I believe that there are many letters written to the Sydney Morning Herald and other places by Tebbutt himself, with hundreds of letters to the editor, having a swipe at the local Church of England in Windsor, which I'll come back to that in a minute. But this created such a kerfuffle that the man was probably continually at war with his own church. And also, it's true to say that he made several professional astronomy enemies. And my interpretation of that is that he was as we said, the very early part, left school at 15, self-made. Whereas many of the people who were in the astronomy and scientific community were at least educated to the master's level, and many of the people, they were also church people. So like Scott, whose name was mentioned a while ago, was a Reverend Scott, and he had a BA or MA or something. So Tebbutt was what you might call sort of a bit of a chip on the shoulder, homegrown, self-educated bloke who didn't get on very well with the establishment. Now that may be a slightly unfair comment, but I'm trying to delve a bit deeper into this than what thing. Okay, now anyhow, push comes to shove, and he died in 1916, and he was buried in the. So I was reading my head of my own notes. He's buried in the Anglican cemetery at the St Matthew's Church of England in Windsor, and before he died, he built in the churchyard, as was fashionable then. Nowadays you don't find cemeteries in churchyards, but in those days he built in a churchyard. He built his own tomb, a family tomb, and I'll come back and show you some pictures, etc., of that. But he built this tomb, and the word on the street is that he was so much at war with the minister of St Matthew's, who was either low church or high church, I don't know which, but he was so much at war with his local minister that he built this thing right in the middle of the churchyard to get up the local minister's nostrils. And because he was quite a wealthy man, the church accepted his, and a devout man. They couldn't say he wasn't devout; they just didn't like him. Okay, so they built this massive, great family vault in the middle of the cemetery, he is buried in that. Also, his estate was valued at about £70,000. I don't know what that is, but somebody can look up what £70,000 was worth in 1916, and I would suggest that was more than 4 houses in Windsor. Wow. Okay.
At least.
Okay, so what happened? This was 1916. You may remember that at that stage, Australia was, like the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world were in world war. It was called World War I, 1914, 1918, and the amount of grieving and concern for Mr. Tebbutt was probably lost somewhat in more pressing and necessary things of the time. Anyhow, this is a photograph taken of the funeral, and these pictures are pretty awful, I know, but here you'll see a marble tower just there, bear that in mind, and here you'll see a vault and flowers sitting on top of the vault. The marble tower, of course, is this one, which is in front of the church, and this is St Matthew's Anglican Church in Windsor, and this was built by one of Australia's first architects, a guy called Graeme White, who he came out, he hopping around on the log as well, a bit like my great-granddad, and he was a convict, and he turned out to be an architect, and he built this, and he also built the Great Hall at Sydney University, I believe. So he built this church, and it is a Church of England, and I think it is Low Church, but I don't know, but certainly it was directly opposite to whatever Tebbutt was. And that's another photograph of the church, and you can see the graves in the foreground. That's a churchyard, a genuine churchyard of the English style, and as I said, you don't find that nowadays. But in that churchyard, this is Tebbutt's crypt, vault, and that photo I showed you with the flowers, they were sitting on top of this metal door, and that's a metal door which can be undone, taken up, steps inside. I've never been in, but I believe it's lined with coffins. The vault itself has, here you see John Tebbutt, Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. That's the plaque for himself, and you can see there's plenty of other Tebbutts in here. There are 4 domes on the top of the structure, and these domes are made of marble. And if you look closely, you can see meridians of right ascension and parallels of latitude have been scribed into the marble in lead, which is the way they used to do it those days. They'd carve a groove into the stone, and then they drill little holes through the bottom of the groove and pour lead, hot molten lead into that, and that would create a line. It's quite dated now, but you can probably see it better there, okay? In fact, you can see the little dots. The dots are where the leads come out, and all you can see is the holes. And there's the, died 82, November 1916, etc. So anyhow, that's his term. Now, I don't expect you to read all this, but this was the obituary that turned up in the Sydney Morning Herald after his death. And you can read it all if you like. Basically, he said he was a jolly good fellow and a good scientist, until you get down to here and a bit further down. There was a great love of truth that caused the deceased to be misunderstood from the religious point of view. And if you read down further, it says, Ladies Tebbutt never really left the church, blah, blah, blah. But it's often said with the truth. And he makes the case here that Tebbutt's beliefs in faith were driven very much by science. He believed in science first, and how science was the truth, the ultimate truth, and that religion had to come to that, as to be distinct from the other way around. So you can read that there. I'll let anyone who wants to read it later can read it. But it's so as an obituary, you see most of it's about well, down to here. I think that bit from there to there is basically about religion and his altercations with the church, has to be distinct from his science. Okay, but sorry. At the very end of this, it says so. This is in 2 parts. Amongst those who attended either at the church or at the graveside, and that's about 10 paces away from each other, were, next slide, Walter Frederick Gale. Now, first name, Walter Frederick Gale, Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, President of the New South Wales branch of the British Astronomical Association. Okay, Walter Frederick Gale was another character in Australian astronomy. And I don't want to talk about him, I could do that probably all night, but what you may like to know is that when he died, they named a crater on Mars after Walter Frederick Gale, Australian astronomer, a crater on the planet Mars. And 2 years ago, a spacecraft called Curiosity landed in Gale crater on Mars. Wow. Okay. And James Nagle, he was he went on to become the government astronomer for New South Wales, but he was actually superintendent of technical education. So he was the first. He was right at the top of Tech Ed. And the rest of it, just you can read for yourself some of these people. But this guy in the astronomy world is well, very well respected. Okay, so let's talk about his legacy, what happened after he died. That photo there is actually the enlargement of one of the previous ones I showed you. And this is not a particularly good print, but I had a friend of mine who was right into photography do some work on this photo, and you can actually see how he was very old, and you can his eyelids at the bottom were hanging away from the eyeball. You ever see that in really old people, like me? Okay, so that was him in his very old age. This here is on the back. This is the 8-inch telescope, and this here is the a 5-hour micrometer, used for measuring positions of stars, particularly double stars. And the way it works is it has a protractor around there. When you look through the eyepiece here, you can see 2 cross wires on the sky, and then you can turn this around so that the cross wires go around like that. You dump one of them on your target, that's you, sir, okay, and you squeeze it out then to get the other guy, that's you, sir, right? And you then go like that, and then you can read off that distance and that angle, and that gives you the position, angle, and separation of the astronomical object. Now that's his legacy. Now, I think what I really wanted to say there, no, maybe not. Okay, now he published 370 scientific publications in scientific journals, most of them being in Astronomy and Nachrichten, which was a German journal, and 120 in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, which is today, both of those, but this one in particular, is today one of the major publications of scientific material, MNRAS. These were scientific papers. Most of them were observational data, positions, magnitudes, things like that. He also, many of them were on comets, local eclipses, southern hemisphere variable stars, double stars, and particularly he was fascinated by a star called Eta Carina, which in his day was called Eta Argus, but it's now called Eta Carina, and double stars Acro. Well, that's the one we were diddling around with at dinner, and Alpha Centauri AB, which is Alpha Cent. Okay, he was awarded the silver medal at the Paris World Exhibition, and you can read there, he was one of 9,500 people around the world who were given the award. There's only 2 went to Australia, and he was one of them. He was given the Jackson Gwilt Medal, which is a very prestigious award given by the Royal Astronomical Society in England, London, in England, and that consists of 200 quid, which I guess bought a few sherbets, and a bronze medal, which are probably kept in the cupboard. Okay, in 1940, the British Association of Advancement of Science came to Australia to come to a conference in Sydney. They went out and saw him, and that was considered to be one of his more favourite happy days. 1973, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, that's the peak astronomical world body in astronomy, astronomical science. They named a crater on the moon after him. And for those of you who've got really good memories, it's not much of a crater. It's a bit hard to find, but let me talk you through it. Crescent moon, early evening. Mare Crisium, the crater is here. Enlargement, Mare Crisium is there. Photographically, this is the moon. Those of you who know the moon will know that's Tycho. Crisium is here. And this is Tranquillitatis there. And there's the crater, and you can zoom up there, and there it is, it's that thing there. So there's a crater on the moon named after Tebbutt, as indeed there's a crater on Mars named after Walter Frederick Gale. Okay, now he was also awarded, he ended up turning up on the $100 note. And you will, those of you who are wealthy enough, you may actually recognise this as being the Australian $100 note. It's now been replaced by another one, but this was one of our plastic notes. And on the other side was Mawson, the Antarctic explorer. So there's Tebbutt on the $100 note. This one's called Specimen. I don't know why. Being so big, I thought it would be worth a lot. Okay, now I've got to tell you guys a story here. I first got interested in Tebbutt some many years ago, and the Professional Astronomical Society of Australia, which is called the ASA, Astronomical Society of Australia, I wrote a little paper about Tebbutt and published it in their journal under the heading of History of Astronomy, and it really went well. And I was working at Sydney University, and one day I got this phone call, but it wasn't in my office, it was down the hall. So I had to rush down the hall, and I said, "Yeah, Graeme White, what do you want?" And this bloke said, "I'm ringing from the Reserve Bank of Australia." And I said, "Oh, yeah, you're trying to sell me something? What do you want? Piss off." Yeah. And he said, "We want to know anything more about Tebbutt." I said, "Oh, well, there's plenty of stuff. Go and look it up." Yeah, basically, I've got things to do. And now, okay, so about 2 years go past, and I'm sitting in the Great Hall, dressed up in my academic robes and everything, my silly hat on, waiting to get my doctorate. And the guest of honour speaker at the ceremony was the governor of the Reserve Bank. And he's talking away, and he says, and we're doing this, and the Australian economy's doing that, and we're going, and we also get out a new note with John Tebbutt. I thought, what? I thought, damn it, I was on a roll there. I should have said to this guy, "Look, leave it to me, mate. I'll fix you up. Just a couple of bundles of old ones." Anyhow, so that's a bit of a personal story there. Right, a minor planet has been named after John Tebbutt. The minor planet is called Minor Planet 11212 Tebbutt. It was previously called 1999 HS and was discovered at Woomera in South Australia by that particular gentleman there. Right, now a little bit of sort of post-family history, nobody in his family actually inherited any interest in this at all. And when he died, the family moved on. Some of his books and journals were given to the Mitchell Library in Sydney, and some of it was considered not of much value and was lost. And this is sort of a uniquey. One of his grandchildren, born 1910, which of course was when Halley's Comet was here, not last time, but the time before. So she was called Edmund Halley Tebbutt, born 1910. Never got around to see the 86 return of Halley's Comet. Would have had to live 76 years. Only lived 68. Bad luck. But that's on the Tebbutt tomb as well. Just another piece of absolute curio rubbish. Apparently, John, when he was alive, in all this altercation with the local minister, when they were painting the crypt, I don't know if you can see here, there's little dots on the crypt, stars painted into the sanctuary, onto the ceiling of the sanctuary, and you see stars painted on there. Well, apparently this has been redone since, but when they were doing it the first time, he lay on the floor here, and he said, "Over here is so-and-so, over here be Alpha Centauri." So the faultless sky as remembered by John Tebbutt. How about that for an absolute piece of trivial rubbish? Okay, so let's get back to what happened. This is what the observatory is today. You can go out there, you can see it. This telescope, that's been recovered, but this one is a story in itself. This is the 8-inch grub. Now, I was actually instrumental in getting this thing back. What happened was that after Tebbutt died, that telescope was moved on to other people. I went to 2 or 3 people, ended up in Watatani, and a guy, a very elderly gentleman who's now deceased called Frank Bateson, knew all about it. And I went to go to this conference in New Zealand. I sit down at the conference dinner, we chat, and I said, what? And he said, oh yeah, blah, blah, and I said, by the way, I said, you don't know where the Tebbutt telescope is, do you? He said, I'm Frank Bateson. I said, what? Good to meet you, Frank. So anyhow, a little while later, a couple of years later, I get a phone call from the Windsor Council. The mayor of Windsor rings up and says, do you know where the telescope is? I said, yep. He said, can we get it back? I said, it's going to cost you. He said, oh, don't worry about that. We're the council. And the story goes that I said, look, it's an 8-inch telescope. I said, why don't you just start the bargain and see if I'll swap it for an 8-inch telescope? And he said, well, try that. And they came back and said, yes. And then they came back and said, no. So I said, he rang me, he said, not going to wear that. I said, well, rank it up, 14. So they swapped it for a 14-inch telescope. And the RAF, who have an air base at Windsor, they went over and the RAF boys boxed it and brought it back. It's been restored and placed back in the observatory. So it is there. That's basically a thing. Okay, the actual Peninsula Farm itself, this is the original Tebbutt homestead, but it is now a wedding venue. And you can see here, this is the sort of thing, when you get married, you can get a ride around the horse. Seems like a pretty expensive way to get a ride on a horse, but anyhow. And the old barn is now the wedding reception venue, where you can go and lock hands and sing Old Lang Syne. Okay, now, very quickly, let's talk about something far more serious. Is comets. 2 comets, 1861 and 1881. I probably shouldn't go through too much of this. But this is when he discovered the 1861 comet. He wrote to the Sydney Morning Herald, and it's beautifully written. It says, this is written to the editor. It says, "Sir, will you kindly allow me, through the columns of your valuable paper, to appraise your international astronomical readers of the presence of a comet?" And I thought, yeah, isn't that well written? Anyhow, that's what he said, and he said, here it is. Here's the right ascension declination of it, right? And I am, comma, your sir, comma, your obedient servant, comma, John Tebbutt, comma, Junior, Windsor, May 13th. And I thought, isn't that just lovely? It's just a piece of old respect that you don't get nowadays. Quality respect. Okay, I won't go through this too much. This is his own description of the comet, and I think Seeger's getting on a bit. I might just skip through this and say, these are the parameters of his comet. Discovered John Tebbutt, 1861, on May 25th, 1861. It's aphelion. Closest distance to the Sun was 109 astronomical units. Perihelion, my apology, longest distance from the Sun. Perihelion, shortest distance to the Sun, 0.822 AU, which probably puts it about the orbit of Venus. Semi-major axis, it's an ellipse, so it's 55.1. Eccentricity, 0.98, pretty close to circle. Period, 900 years. Inclination, it's due back in 2265. My guess is they got no idea what it's due back. That'd be my guess, if I had to put money on it. Okay, this is a drawing of it, and here is another. That's probably a better drawing of the comet, fabulous comet at that type stage. And drawings of the head of the comet seen by different astronomers around the world with powerful telescopes. And you see the sort of shockwave bursts of gas that came off the comet. Okay, second comet, 1861. Again, this is probably too much detail for you. I seem to have run out of, and the drawings of it made at the time, and drawings made of it as well at the time by various astronomers. A lot of this stuff comes from a French book called The Comet by a guy called Arago, and drawings of the more technical drawings of what the comet looked like in its head, the head being here and the different shells around it. And its details, it doesn't say when it's coming back. Doesn't say when it's coming back. But this one was the Great Comet of 1881. And right, now, very quickly, because I'm finishing now, I mentioned during the talk some observations that he made of variable stars and double stars and variable stars. This is a diagram which I prepared for another publication. In the southern hemisphere, there is a variable star called R Carina, and R Carina is a pulsating star. These are observations made by Tebbutt. He actually he wrote 6 papers on this particular star, and I've only taken here 1. The other 5 I've not included. Here is the brightness of the star. Now, for the junior astronomers, 6 is what you can see with the naked eye, roughly. These are brighter than that. That's bright going that way. That's dull going that way. So these are naked eye here. Down here, you need a small telescope to see them. Naked eye, down, small telescope. Naked eye, small telescope. Naked eye, small telescope. Okay. That data is now available to people 100 and something odd years later to be able to, 150 years later, to be able to work out, Chris, the period here, the period from this data, and now to look at the period today and to see if the phase has shifted or the. Okay, the second one, which I think is very exciting, is this star here. This is a Hubble telescope photo of a star in the southern sky called Eta Carina. It's a star which blew up in about 1830s and 1840s. As you can see now, looking at this picture, you can see there's the star, and it burnt out the shell on both sides. And you see the shell here, there, and amateur astronomers know this is a musculus or something like that. Anyhow, Eta Carina. These are observations of the brightness of this star made by Tebbutt. And his observations started here about 1852 or something. And he puts it magnitude 1. Magnitude 1. Okay? And then you see his observations track the decline in the brightness until it goes down to about naked eye visibility, about 1868 or something. Then it stays pretty constant, and then he loses track of it. In other words, it's fainter than he can see, so we put an upper arrow, and then he picks up a couple more data points here. That's all very interesting, you say. So let's see where that fits in the big picture. Okay, here's the big picture. 1843, this star was actually brighter than Sirius. It was the brightest star in the sky. And at this point here, and even right through from about 1820s onward, or 1830s, right through here, it was one of the major stars in the sky. It's called Eta Argus. Eta Argus, now called Eta Carina. Okay, so Eta Argus. Now, just to put this into further context, this is now the best data we can get on this star. Over here, we got modern observations done with 1930s to 1950s, probably done with photographic plates, 1960s through to, say, the turn of the century. Well, let's say the last bit here, 1990, here, these would be done by CCD, and probably, and I believe there are a couple of data points in this tail which were done with Hubble. So this is now the this particular, the brightness of this particular star. But Tebbutt gave it his best shot. He gave us from there to there. He gave us that bit there, which I think is very exciting. Okay, that's it, folks. I is done. Any questions? Good on you, mate. David, you have been to.
I have.
You've been to the observatory and you've been to the churchyard.
Yes, been to the churchyard. Had a look at the vault. If you're in Sydney, go out to Windsor and have a look. Take some photos. I've got photos on my laptop, but just going there, especially after hearing this wonderful lecture from Graeme, it just brings it all home. You can just feel, the presence and the history. It's just crying out to you. It's just fascinating. So Windsor's not that far out of Sydney, so if you're down that way, it's definitely worth a trip out.
Is that turned